I will be your moderator for tonight's session. This installment of our 2024 spring webinar series focuses on annual state licensing. Welcome to this webinar sponsored by the City of Los Angeles Department of Cannabis Regulation, Business License, and Compliance Assistance Program. Our BLC programming is designed to assist social equity applicants in the City of LA with obtaining a commercial cannabis license and operating a successful cannabis business. Now, before we get started, let's take a minute to review some housekeeping rules. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and can be viewed only on DCR's Learning Management System after the editing process. You will be muted with cameras off for the duration of the webinar. This means that your camera and audio functions will not be available during this session. However, you will be able to see and hear all the panelists. There is an open chat box where you can interact with one another for networking on the information. Please use caution when sharing personal information in a public forum and keep your questions focused on tonight's topic. Please ask questions about tonight's subject matter in the Q&A box. We are gathering and responding to your questions throughout the presentation, and we'll have a Q&A session. You will also get responses in the last portion of tonight's event. You are encouraged to utilize the Q&A box at the bottom pane of your Zoom. If you use the Q&A box for questions, everyone will be able to see the questions that are answered. And finally, please note that tonight's content was not created by the Department or the City of LA and is for informational purposes only. This information is subject to change and does not replace or supersede the Los Angeles Municipal Code or constitute legal advice. If you have specific questions outside of tonight's topic, please call 213-978-0738 during business hours, Monday through Thursday, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m., or speak to a DCR representative. And now I'd like to introduce our esteemed guest presenter, Courtney Lang. Courtney is a California-based consultant specializing in cannabis real estate, licensing, and business development for over 8 years. She partners with businesses and leadership to build the foundation for a successful company. In addition to her cannabis background, she offers her clients 10 years of experience working in the natural foods industry, several small to medium-sized companies. She has helped form large teams, develop and execute strategic plans and grassroots marketing campaigns, create company-wide policies and procedures, and manage boards and stakeholder groups. And with that, I'd like to turn it over.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brown. It's great to be here. Hello, everyone. My name is Courtney Lang. I am the owner of the Permit Company. For those in the audience today, welcome. I'm not sure who has been to the previous webinar on the annual license process with the Department of Cannabis Regulation. There will be some repeated content from that webinar, but definitely a lot of new content about the annual state license process. So again, today's webinar topic is the annual state license process. As we review today's content, you probably fit in one of two buckets. You're either a new operator who recently submitted applications or will be submitting applications soon, or you're an existing business operator and you're currently operating under a temporary approval and a provisional license. Regardless of which bucket you fall in, you're going to need to either transition to an annual state license or you're applying for an annual state license. And we're going to give you the tools and resources you need to do so. We'll provide a general overview of the licenses and permits you need to establish a cannabis operation in the City of Los Angeles, and a detailed explanation of the state's annual licensing process with the California Department of Cannabis Control. So moving on, let's take a look at the information we'll cover tonight. Next slide, please. So the agenda here is we'll talk first about cannabis licensing background. Just want to make sure we start off at a high level. and give you some information about cannabis licensing. Second will be an overview of the City of Los Angeles licensing and permitting process. So again, a high-level overview of the City of Los Angeles licensing and permitting process. Third, we'll talk about annual state license process. I want to review the process that you'll go through, but also all of the application documents that you're going to be required to submit. Section 4 will be resources. There will be some links that we'll share to all of the participants, but we have the resources that you can utilize to prepare your annual state license. We'll take a look at those in detail, and then we'll move on to the question and answer section. So for everyone that's here tonight, you can be asking questions in the chat box throughout the presentation, or once we get to the Q&A section, up to you when you'd like to submit your questions, but be sure to do so. Okay, so our first topic is background. And what we're going to hit first is what's called dual licensing. So the California Department of Cannabis Control is responsible for issuing the state licenses. So you need a state license, but you also need a local license. And for this case, your local license is going to be with the City of Los Angeles. So everybody in the state of California needs dual licensing. Again, that means you have one, your license with the state of California, and then second, you have a license with your local government. In this example, obviously your local government is the City of Los Angeles. So the annual state license, that's issued by the California Department of Cannabis Control, otherwise known as DCC. And so the Department of Cannabis Control started issuing licenses in 2018. First, they issued what was called a temporary license. They're no longer issuing temporary licenses. After they stopped issuing temporary licenses, then they started issuing provisional licenses. And in 2023, the California Department of Cannabis Control no longer started accepting provisional licenses. So everyone has now to submit annual state licenses to the Department of Cannabis Control, except for local equity retailer license applicants. So at this point in time, everyone needs to submit an annual state license with the Department of Cannabis Control, except for local equity retailer license applicants. Those applicants can still submit what's called the provisional license application. The Department of Cannabis Regulation provides oversight for administering the commercial cannabis licensing and regulatory program in the City of Los Angeles. The DCR was established in 2017 and started issuing temporary approvals shortly thereafter. Similar to the Department of Cannabis Control, in 2023, the City of Los Angeles Department of Cannabis Regulation launched its annual license application process. So you might be wondering, what's the difference between an annual state license and a provisional state license? An annual state license is subject to CEQA compliance. The DCC, the Department of Cannabis Control, may only issue an annual state license once a project complies with CEQA. So you need to be in compliance with CEQA before an annual license can be issued. So for general applicants, the Department of Cannabis Control is no longer accepting applications for provisional licenses. All new applications will be annual state license applications, except for qualified local equity retailer license applicants. Retail provisional licenses are available until January 1st, 2031 for local equity applicants. So just to review, the Department of Cannabis Control is no longer accepting applications for provisional licenses unless you're a retailer. And so for all those who are required to submit an annual state license at this time, you'll need to comply with CEQA. We'll talk about CEQA a little bit later in the webinar so that you understand that. So what's the difference between the Department of Cannabis Regulations annual license and temporary approval? The annual license application is a longer process, which includes an environmental analysis, also known as CEQA review. So it involves this environmental analysis for all businesses as well. It includes community meetings, public hearings for retail storefront businesses with temporary approval, while temporary approval does not necessitate these requirements. So again, the annual license application, it's a longer process. You have CEQA review that's being done, which makes that a lot longer of a process. And if you're a retailer, in addition to CEQA, there is a couple of public hearings and community meetings that are involved. So for general applicants, DCR is no longer accepting applications for temporary approval. So for general applicants, they're going to be applying for an annual license with DCR. However, if you're a social equity applicant, you can receive temporary approval during the annual license process, as long as you have a state provisional license. This leads us to the next question, which is, what is CEQA? CEQA stands for California Environmental Quality Act. CEQA is a 1970s state law that requires environmental review of proposed projects. This was passed when Ronald Reagan was governor, so quite some time ago. What this means is that all annual state licenses with the Department of Cannabis Regulation are subject to CEQA compliance. The DCC may only issue an annual license once a project complies with CEQA. Local governments typically act as the lead agency for reviewing CEQA documents and approving a project. The DCR requires applicants to submit CEQA documents for review as part of the annual license application. On these last few slides, we will take a look at DCC's fees. So first, you'll see on this slide, we're looking at the retail licenses. This includes the storefront retail licenses as well as non-storefront delivery. The state has broken these fees into two categories: application fees and license fees. Application fees are paid up front. License fees are paid once the application has been approved. You must pay the license fee before the license certificate is issued. So for example, for retail, as you can see on this slide, for retail businesses, for distributors, for manufacturing and testing labs, pretty much everyone besides cultivation, your application fee is going to be $1,000. So once you prepare your application and you submit it online, you'll have to pay the $1,000 application fee before the DCC reviews your application. Once you've paid the fee and your application has been reviewed and approved, then your license fee is paid. And your license fee, as you can see here, is based on gross annual revenue. So for anyone that's applying for the first year of operation, typically you're going to put yourself in tier 1, which is less than or equal to $500,000. And so therefore your license fee would be $2,500. As you begin to move forward with your operation and you're renewing your applications, at that point, then you'll decipher which tier you fit into. And that's going to be based on your gross annual revenue. And typically you'll want to provide a profit and loss statement, a simple profit and loss statement that shows what your gross annual revenue was. And that's how you'll base which tier you fit into. Again, so you've got your application fee due when you submit your application. The license fee is due once you're approved. The next piece of important information that you don't see on this slide, but I just want to make sure I hit, is that once your license has been, your application has been reviewed and approved, you have 60 days to pay that license fee. And if you don't pay that license fee within the 60 days, they will or they can abandon your application and make you go through the whole process again. So you want to make sure that you've got your fee and your money lined up to pay your fees when you get your application approved. Because if it goes longer than 60 days, you don't obviously want to have your application abandoned and have to start that process over again. So here you've got the retail fees. Next slide, it's going to show you what the fees are for testing labs. Again, it's $1,000 application fee. Then based on your gross net revenue, you'll see it starting at $3,000 for the license fee. On the next slide, we've got the distribution license fees. So we've got the $1,000 up front for the application. And then once your application has been reviewed and approved, you'll be starting at a $1,500 license fee. And next is manufacturing. And so the manufacturing license fees, as you can see, $1,000 up front, and then starting at $2,000 based on gross revenue. Okay. Next, we're going to move to the overview of the City of Los Angeles licensing and permitting process. Here, we'll take a look at the various licenses and permits you'll need across various city and county departments and agencies. Okay, so take a look at this slide. Here, I have broken the local licensing and permitting process into 6 steps. So the 6 steps are in light blue. The first step is getting your business entity established with the City of Los Angeles. There's a getting started checklist that we'll share at the end of this webinar that will provide instructions on how to get your business tax registration certificate, the BTRC, and to create a legal business entity record, your LBER. The second step is to submit a pre-application. The pre-application is the process of determining proposed business premise location compliance and eligibility. Again, I'll provide a resource at the end of the webinar to guide you through the pre-app process. The third step is the annual license with the Department of Cannabis Regulation. Fourth is the certificate of occupancy and building permits. Fifth is what's called a public health permit. Sixth is the operating permit. And then in orange is your annual license, your annual state license. All right, let's take a closer look at step 1. Step 1, apply for a business tax registration certificate and a legal business entity record. Applying for a business tax registration certificate is done through the Office of Finance. You must have an entity registered with the state of California to start this process. So you'll need the articles of incorporation or organization, a federal employer identification number, and a seller's permit with the state of California or with the IRS in order to start this process. Here are the forms that you need in order to obtain your legal business entity record. You've got your California Secretary of State registration, your California Secretary of State Statement of Information, the Financial Information Form, which is a form provided by the Department of Cannabis Control. It's on their website. Fourth is Primary Personnel and Owner Attestation Form. Fifth is Ownership and Financial Interest Holder Form. Those last 2 are forms provided by the Department of Cannabis Control. And if you're in the social equity program, you're going to want to provide the owner compliance attestation, your equity share documents, which is your operating agreement or your bylaws, and MSO agreements if applicable. Step 2 is pre-application. Pre-application is the process of ensuring the local compliant or location compliance and eligibility. This is where DCR verifies zoning and sensitive use compliance for your property. So once you find a location that you believe is compliant, you would submit your pre-application. And the required forms and information that you'll need to submit is 1, the property address, and 2, the landowner attestation form. Next up, step 3 is DCR's annual license, which is the process whereby DCR conducts CEQA review. And for retailers in particular, this is what involves engaging with the public through outreach and meetings. Step 4 is certificate of occupancy and building permits from the Department of Building and Safety. This process is what you'll do to ensure the interior of the building and premise is suitable for cannabis operations. All operators must obtain a COO, or a certificate of occupancy, from the Department of Building and Safety. If improvements are made to the building, tenants must submit building permits prior to construction. So if you're putting in any new walls or doors or wiring new lights, things that, any improvements that aren't just coats of paint and cosmetic, you'll need to apply for building permits. If you're only making cosmetic changes, you'll still need to apply for a new certificate of occupancy, but building permits are not needed. So what you'll be looking to do is first to verify the use or occupancy of the building. So this is verifying that the proposed business premise location is consistent with the current permitted use of the building. If your premise is not consistent, currently verified as an occupancy that works with your business, then you'll have to get a building permit. So a building permit is required if you're changing the use of the building, if you have tenant improvements, or if you're conducting any construction on site. And a certificate of occupancy is issued once construction is complete and all inspections have been passed. Step 5 is the public health permit. This is the process of ensuring that the building and operation is safe for cannabis operations and consumers. All licensees must obtain a public health permit for each commercial cannabis activity from the County of Los Angeles. You must have a COO before you can apply for this permit. So again, the public health permit is actually with the County of Los Angeles, and you'll need to have your COO before you can apply for this permit. And you'll need one of these for each of your activities. So step 6 is operating permit. And this is the process of permitting the business operation. To obtain an operating permit from DCR, a licensee must submit all permits, clearances, licenses, and other authorizations required by law. Some examples would include the Department of Building and Safety and Fire Department. So you obviously need to have your annual license submitted. Everything that we just mentioned, all of those permits and such need to be submitted and cleared. You'll need to obtain an emblem placard from the LA County Department of Public Health. And third, once you've demonstrated that you have all of the clearances and permits that we just discussed, you'll have to pass a DCR's final inspection. And step 7 is the annual state license, a license issued by the California Department of Cannabis Control. And this is what we will review in the next section. So that does it for the overview portion of this webinar. Before we move on, I'll quickly summarize the various permits and licenses a business must obtain before operating a cannabis business in the city of LA. So First is getting your business entity established with the City of Los Angeles Office of Finance by obtaining a business tax registration certificate and registering your legal business entity record on the licensing portal. So step one, again, you've established your entity with the state, and so therefore you can file for your business tax registration certificate, and you'll be able to register your legal business entity record on the City of Los Angeles licensing portal. The second step is once you have your location identified, your business premise, you'll submit a pre-application for review by the Department of Cannabis Regulation. And so that's just going to be submitting your address and submitting a landowner authorization form that shows that you have authorization to move forward with a license application at your premise. The third step is the annual license with the Department of Cannabis Regulation. Again, the annual license is going to involve your CEQA review. So really important part of the process. You'll submit your annual license with the Department of Cannabis Regulation. And again, that's where your CEQA compliance and your CEQA review will get done. Once you have submitted your annual license, then you can get started on your certificate of occupancy and building permits. Again, if you're not really making any structural changes or electrical changes, plumbing changes, you just need to get your certificate of occupancy. If you are making significant changes to your premise, you're going to need to get a building permit. Once you have acquired your certificate of occupancy, you'll then work with the county to get your public health permit. You'll get one for each activity. So if you're doing manufacturing and distribution, you're going to need a public health permit for each activity. Once you've obtained your public health permit, then you'll submit for your operating permit. And that's where you're going to demonstrate to the Department of Cannabis Regulation that you have your certificate of occupancy, that you have your public health permits. And once you can demonstrate that, you will then have to pass a final inspection that the DCR will conduct. All while you're doing this process, you'll need to get your annual state license started, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, so next topic is annual state license. Before I get started, let me take a moment to answer a few important questions. First question is, when do I begin the annual state licensing process? So in order for the Department of Cannabis Control to begin reviewing your application, it's important that you are in compliance with your local government, because the first step the Department of Cannabis Control does when you submit your license application is they reach out to the City of Los Angeles and they ask if your business entity is currently under compliance, if local compliance is underway. And in order for the City of LA to provide that verification to the state, you need to have an annual license application submitted to the Department of Cannabis Regulation, and you need to have received what's called a notice of complete application from DCR. So the annual license, DCR's annual license needs to be submitted, and you need to have received a notice of complete application from the Department of Cannabis Regulation. If you've achieved that status with the Department of Cannabis Regulation, you're ready to submit your annual state license with the Department of Cannabis Control. Because like I said, the first step, once you submit your state application, DCC reaches out to the City of LA, and they won't review or begin to review your application until you have the status local compliance underway achieved. So important to know when to begin, right? Our next question is where to submit. So all applications for a annual state license have to be submitted through the DCC's licensing portal. So if you go to the Department of Cannabis Control's website, you'll see a tab for applicants, and underneath that tab will be a menu, and you'll see licensing portals as an option, and click there. based on whatever application type you are applying for, it'll lead you to the right licensing portal. So again, just go to DCC's website. They have an applicants tab, and on that applicants tab is where you're going to find the licensing portal, and everything needs to be submitted online. Okay, so now that you know when to submit and where to submit, let's talk about the submittal process. The first step of the annual state license process is preparing and submitting your application. So what you'll need to do is you'll need to collect all of the required forms and documents and have your application fee ready to be paid. So once you submit the application on the DCC's licensing portal, typically it'll take them maybe a week to respond, and they'll have already taken a look at all the application documents that you have submitted, and they'll provide you, they'll send an email out, and it'll be titled First Notice. It'll have your application number, and that'll be in the title. So First Notice, application number, that'll be in the title. Again, I usually receive them within the first week after submitting the documents and the fees, but sometimes it can take a little bit longer. It just depends. But that first notice, it's important to mark that date in your calendar, because based on receiving that first notice, you have 180 days or 6 months from that date to complete your annual state license application with the state. So, sometimes folks will submit an incomplete application. Totally understandable. It happens. But just so you know, you've got 180 days to complete it. And just make sure you put that date in your calendar and a couple of reminders so that you don't forget when that is. You'll receive a lot of notifications from the state as well, but it's handy to have it in your calendar. Okay. So you need to prepare all of your documents before submitting online. And here is a list of all the documents that you'll need to submit. First is your business entity formation documents. We've talked about this a little bit. You can't register your business entity on the Department of Cannabis Regulations portal, nor can you submit an annual state license unless you've registered your entity with the state of California. So you'll need your articles of incorporation or organization. You'll need your statement of information. You'll need your federal employer identification number that's registered with the IRS. And then you also need your seller's permit. In addition to those, depending on whether you're an LLC or a corporation, you need your bylaws or an operating agreement. So those are your business entity formation documents. Again, your articles of incorporation and statement of information, those are filed with the Secretary of State. You have your federal employer identification number, which is filed with the IRS, and then your seller's permit, which is also filed with the state of California. Next is the legal right to occupy. The state calls the legal right to occupy. They have this term for what is really your landowner approval forms. So number one, if you own the property and the property is in the same entity as the license entity, then you can just submit with the property deed. So again, if the deed is in an entity name that matches the entity on the license application, you can just submit a property deed. If the name on the deed and the entity name on the license application are different, even if it's the same person who owns 100% of this two different entities, doesn't matter. If the entities do not match on the deed and the application, then you need a commercial lease, which is pretty standard. Most people are going to be submitting a commercial lease. So if you're submitting a commercial lease, it's really important to make sure that the name, the property owner matches what's on the deed, and that the tenant's name matches the entity that's going to be on the license application. That's really important. A lot of times people will get a commercial lease in the owner's name as an individual, not an entity. So instead of the permit company, they might have it in Courtney Lang's name, and that will not suffice. You need to make sure the commercial lease is in the business entity's name that will be on the license. So make sure that matches. So that's the property deed and or commercial lease section of the legal right to occupy. The second part is what's called the landowner approval form. The state has a landowner approval form, a template on their website, again, under the applicants tab. There's a resource section and it provides you with a template form. It's called the landowner approval form. And this is a form that you're going to need to have your landowner sign. Doesn't need to be notarized, but it does need to be signed by your landowner. Moving on, you've got the list of owners and financial interest holders. So before you submit an application, I'm sure your bylaws or operating agreement will have already been executed. So you'll know who is an owner versus who is a financial interest holder. And a financial interest holder, you'll want to make sure that you have at least a government ID. If it's an individual, you want to have their government ID. If the financial interest holder is a business entity, you need their federal employer identification number. And again, for owners, the list of owners, you'll have to submit what's called an owner application for each of the owners. And an owner application consists of personal information. So you'll need things like their social security number, you'll need their date of birth, and mailing address. You'll also want to submit a copy of their government ID, and you'll very likely have to submit a live scan application. So a couple things with the personal, with the owner applications. So owner applications are tied to social security numbers. So you have to submit the owner application online. It is a separate application from your state license. But when you submit your state license, you're going to add the owner's information, such as Courtney Lang, right? And you'll add an email address, and you need to have their social security number, like I said. So once you add that information into your application, when you're submitting it online, it will, after you've completed your annual state license submittal, it will automatically send an email to any of the owners that you added, and it'll say, please complete an owner application. And they'll need to come onto the Department of Cannabis Control's website and register their own account. And again, they're tied to social security numbers. So if any owners have been a part of another application, they'll use the same DCC login that they used on previous applications. If they're not on any other applications, then they'll need to start a new account. And again, it's attached to email address and the social security numbers. So the owner applications, those are submitted separately, but you do, as a part of the annual state license application, still need to at least submit personal information for each applicant. So before I submit an annual state license application, I request a copy of a government ID and a live scan application from each of the owners. So I have all that personal information. So for you, if you're submitting your application and on behalf of you and other owners, I would get that information ahead of time. Next is the premise diagram, and the premise diagram, there's a template, and that'll basically list out everything that you need to put into the premise diagram. And you can do that yourself, whether it's hand-drawn or whether you use some kind of online platform. While something like a building permit, you'll need to hire an architect to put together. You can prepare your premise diagram, and the state provides a template for that. Evidence of CEQA compliance. So we've talked about this. Obviously, CEQA compliance is achieved by applying for an annual license with the Department of Cannabis Regulation. And once it's approved, once your annual license is approved and CEQA has been reviewed and approved as well, you'll need to provide that documentation to the state. So you might put a placeholder in for now. If you're applying for it and your annual license hasn't been approved yet with the city, you can submit a placeholder, but in order for you to get approved, you will need to submit the final approval from the Department of Cannabis Regulation. Next is a surety bond. So for each license application you submit, you need a $5,000 surety bond, and this is to cover the application fees in case you don't pay them. But a surety bond, you can usually obtain that from your insurance broker. Next is a notarized labor peace agreement or a waiver. Again, there is a template on DCC's website that you can use. In most cases, you need what's called an OSHA statement. And for most licenses, you need to make sure that you have at least one manager and one employee that have gone through OSHA training within the first year of operating. And this OSHA statement needs to confirm that. And last is your social equity fee relief form. The social equity fee relief form is to demonstrate that you are in a local social equity program. So you're eligible for either fee waivers, fee deferrals, and also priority licensing and priority review for your license application. So definitely, again, important to submit the social equity fee relief form. That is template is available online. It's pretty easy to put together and submit, but that's going to allow you to qualify for fee waivers if they're available, fee deferrals. They'll defer your fees for 6 months if you'd like that. And then in addition, that will help make sure you get priority review when you submit your annual state license as part of a local program, a local social equity program. You do receive priority review with the state, and that form helps them to identify. Okay, that was a lot on one slide, but hopefully you took some notes and found some information useful. In terms of the required forms, I just wanted to hit on a few tips that are really important. So number one is to make sure the business entity name on all documents matches the business entity name on your entity registration paperwork filed with the Secretary of State exactly. So when you file your articles of organization or incorporation with the state, it's going to be called the Permit Company Inc. or the Permanent Company LLC. And you want to make sure that the name on the registration paperwork transfers to every single document exactly the way you see it on the form that you filed with the Secretary of State. Obviously, that's your duty to make sure that it's right on the lease or the deed. You want to make sure, obviously, the surety bonds too, any insurance that you're applying for, any of the applications that you're submitting on the portal, and any forms that you're preparing, the landowner authorization forms, the OSHA paperwork, the labor peace agreement, all of those application forms. So make sure that the business entity name is exactly the same on every single document and application that you're submitting. And double check the work of other people. So if you have an insurance broker who's filling out your surety bond, double check their work, make sure that the business entity name matches. The other piece is the premise address. Again, it can very easily get messed up on a surety bond or an application form. So make sure that it's exactly the same all the way across all your documents, and make sure you include a suite number if you have one, and that you're consistently including it. It's either on all of your documents, the suite number, or it's not, right? Everything's got to be consistent. Another component here is that your surety bond, so you need to get a surety bond. Again, you'll work with typically an insurance agent to get that. And you'll need it prior to getting your application approved. But you also need to make sure that you renew that each year. It is your responsibility to make sure that your surety bond is, you maintain activity just like you would with an insurance. You're gonna need to renew it. The other piece of information is there's been some recent changes to the live scan process. So you'll need to get a live scan done with the state, but wait until your application's been submitted and until they provide you with a form. So when they send out that first notice Similarly, and right around the same time, they'll send out a notice to you about your owner application and whether or not you need to submit a live scan. So they'll give you a specific form and it has a couple of sections filled out already. So you want to wait until the state gives you the live scan form before you go get one. It has specific codes that they'll input into the form, and if those aren't properly on the form when you go get a live scan, it won't work, and you'll have to go redo it. So don't get the live scan done until the state provides you a form. Okay, so there are required forms specifically for each license type. So I did want to make sure we reviewed those as well. The list that I sent you, or the list that, sorry, is on the slide that we reviewed earlier, that's the list that you're going to need when you submit the application. This list for each license type that I'm about to provide you, some of those will be requested after you submit the application. So if it's, again, when you're filling out the application and you're uploading the forms, it'll give you a list of the required forms. And the one that we just went over, those are all that'll be listed. These are additional forms. You can upload them when you're submitting your initial application, or you can wait until the state requests them from you, because sometimes they don't require them. So in the case of a provisional license, if you're a retailer applying for a provisional license, you might not need to provide all these operating procedures, versus if you're an annual license, they'll definitely request them later down the road if you don't submit them. So the manufacturing specific documents, you've got a product and activities list. So this is where you're going to specify if you're doing type 6, which is non-volatile, type 7, which is volatile, a type N, which is infusion, or type P, which is packaging. You're going to provide them with a list of which activities you'll be participating in, which license types are you participating in. So that specific information will need to be provided. In addition, you'll have to provide a product list. A product list is specifying whether you're going to be making vape pens, whether you'll be doing tinctures, chocolate bars. That's where you get specific about each of the product categories that you intend to manufacture at your site. Whether you intend to manufacture them or if you're intending just to package them, you need to provide a list of the products that you're going to be manufacturing or packaging. Next, if you're a type 7 applicant, you would need a closed loop certification. Again, that's only if you're a type 7. And then for all manufacturing licenses, you need to provide good manufacturing practices, or SOPs. And the 4 main areas are inventory control, quality control, a product recall plan, and waste management. There are great resources on the Department of Cannabis Control's website. Again, if you go to the applicant tab and click on resources, you'll be shown a list of manufacturing resources and templates, SOP templates. So those are great to use. So required forms for distribution, they are going to request standard operating procedures. You're going to need proof of insurance. So specifically for distribution, you're going to need a general liability policy, and you'll have to provide it. Most businesses have this regardless, but this is the only state license that requires you to upload it as a part of the application. And then typically within the standard operating procedures, you're going to provide transport vehicle information. So if you're a distributor, you're going to likely have 1 or more vehicles, and those vehicles need to be registered and insured. You'll just need to provide some of that information. Next is retail specific documents. So again, you'll have some standard operating procedures that you'll need to provide. And then you'll also provide delivery information, delivery vehicle information. Cultivation is a lighting diagram, a pest management plan, a waste management plan, a property diagram, and a premise diagram. The premise diagram for cultivation is different. There's more required in that plan than there is for the other licenses. So there is a resource available for cultivators who are preparing a premise diagram. Okay. The next, for cultivators specifically, you also have a couple of additional waivers or permits that you're going to need to apply for. So there's the State Water Resource Control Board. If you're in LA, you're an indoor cultivator. So all you need to do is you need to enroll in this program. And you will just receive a waiver because this Water Resource Control Board discharge program is really for folks that are discharging into rural communities and streams and such. So you'll just apply for a waiver. Similar with Fish and Wildlife, lake or stream bed alteration agreement or verification that one is not needed. Again, since you're indoor, you just need a letter that shows you're not required to have a lake and stream bed alteration. Next is the Department of Pesticide, County Ag Commissioner, and this is where you're going to register the use of your pesticides prior to using any of them. So again, you'll work with the Los Angeles County Ag Commissioner, and you'll need to get you'll need to register as a pesticide use and before you are applying those to any of your plants. And the operating procedures that are going to be required for cultivators, you've got transportation procedures, inventory procedures, non-laboratory quality control procedures, and security procedures. So again, we talked about the review process and that you're going to receive an email titled First Notice. And you'll receive that from the Department of Cannabis Control at least within 2 to 3 weeks after you submit your application. And in that first notice, they'll list out everything that's missing in your application. From that first notice, you have 180 days to finish your annual state license application. If at any point after the first notice, there's still insufficient information, you'll have time, again, that 6 months to submit it. And you'll work directly with a licensing analyst to complete your application. But here you've got what it's going to look like on the back end. Once you've submitted your license application, when you're in the record, there is a drop-down menu that shows you your application information, such as your business entity, your premise address. Another tab is going to show you all the attachments that you've uploaded. Another tab will show you the fees that you've paid and provide you with a receipt. Another tab is going to be the processing status. And this is really helpful for you because you are going to receive emails as the state's reviewing your application. So you'll be able to reference that. But you can also reference where you're at in the process on this processing tab. So obviously, the first is application acceptance. Once you have paid your fee and submitted all your documents, you'll get that first notice email. And that's where they're conducting the admin and the business review. The admin and business review is where they're going to take a look at your business premise documents. So your legal right to occupy. They're going to want to look at your deed or your lease and your landowner form. They're also going to look at your business entity registration forms in this section, the surety bond, your insurance. Those will be all reviewed at the admin and business review section. Once that's also going to be where they do the owner application reviews. Once you've passed that part of the review, then it moves to scientific review. And scientific review is where they take a closer look at your operating procedures, your premise diagram, and where they're going to require you to have your CEQA compliance completed. So the admin and business review usually takes about like a month and a half to finish. Then it moves to the scientific review, which then also takes about another month and a half. So again, scientific review is going to be the premise diagram. That's going to be where you also need to make sure CEQA compliance is done and where your operating procedures will get reviewed. Once that review is done, you'll have a final review, which is typically just a final manager signing off on your application that it's complete. And when the final review is done, you'll get an email that says your application's been approved. And in between final review and issuance, that's when you have to pay the fee. So final review is done. You'll get a notification saying that you're approved. Then you have 60 days to pay your fee. So, and once it's issued, and then it's closed out, right? So that is the process, the review process. And again, once you submit your application, on the record, you'll have a tab that says processing status. And if you click on it, it'll show you if you've completed that part by the green check mark. Okay, so next, I just wanted to take a look at some resources. First would be the cultivation plan. So I don't have it linked here because it was recently taken off of the Department of Cannabis Control's website. So maybe we'll try to follow up with this. But a cultivation plan, that is a complete guide that the Department of Cannabis Control put together for cultivators that provides template premise diagrams, template lighting diagrams, the template waste management, pest management, pretty much all those additionally required documents for cultivation. It went through those in lengthy detail. So we'll see if we can get you guys a copy of that. But the cultivation plan is really helpful, obviously, if you are a cultivator. Number 2 linked here is the premise diagram template that is for all licensees except for cultivation. So the premise diagram, it's going to list everything that you need to put in there, like the property dimensions, your premise dimensions. You need to label all the doorways. You need to label all the rooms. So anyhow, it'll provide you with a list of everything that you need to put on your premise diagram. Number 3 is a list of the annual state license fees. Here you'll be able to decide or to figure out, based on which license type you're applying for and your gross revenue, what's going to be due for the application to be submitted and once you're approved. The 4th one here is the surety bond. So you'll want to use this surety bond form when you contact your insurance broker. Make sure that they have this form and they use that when they issue a surety bond. So it's a specific form that the state provides that you'll want to use. Number 5 is a labor peace agreement. Again, the state has graciously provided you with a template that you will fill out. This does need to be notarized. And 6th is the landowner approval consent form. Again, the state provides a template, and this form will need to be signed by the landowner. So all these links have been provided to you. And I believe we are ready to move on with our question and answer portion of the webinar. You can enter your questions in the chat box, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Beebe.
Hey. Can you guys hear me and see me? Can you see me?
We can hear you.
Okay. That's okay. I guess my camera's not working now. All right, let's just go to the Q&A. Thank you so much, Courtney. You have such a comprehensive understanding of the licensure process. All right, our first question. Can I deliver within the city of Los Angeles limits if I have a state license and a license in another local jurisdiction?
So the short answer to that is yes. But you do need to make sure that if you're permitted in another local jurisdiction and you're delivering in the city of LA, that you do register for a tax certificate with the city of LA, and that any sales made in the city of LA, that you're paying taxes to the city of LA. So again, if you have a state license and a license in another jurisdiction for delivery, you can deliver into the city of LA limits, but you need to make sure you register for a tax certificate and that you're paying taxes on those sales.
Okay, great. Next question. Can I pay for an independent CEQA analyst to speed up the CEQA review?
Well, not here in LA, no. There's no opportunity to speed up the CEQA review process. In our previous webinar about the DCR annual licensing process, we talked about CEQA review and how the city's prioritizing it. So that's how the city's working through CEQA, and by hiring somebody, it's not going to speed up the process.
Okay. Do I submit my BTRC to the Office of Finance or DCR?
That's a great question. So the BTRC, it'll be issued by the Office of Finance, but you do want to submit it to DCR. So the business tax registration certificate, the form that we provided you, you'll want to submit that to DCR, and they'll coordinate with the Office of Finance to process your application. And you'll receive a notification when it's complete. But again, you'll want to submit that form to DCR, and they'll work with the Office of Finance.
I think you covered a little bit about this in your presentation, Courtney, but another question we have is, I currently have a provisional state license. What is an example of the evidence I need to prove that shows I am currently working on obtaining CEQA compliance?
Mm-hmm. So with CEQA compliance with the state, the end goal is what's called a notice of exemption, or a NOE. The DCR issues the notice of exemption once your CEQA review is complete. And the CEQA review is done during the annual license process. So you'll submit your annual license to the Department of Cannabis Regulation. And again, the end goal with the state is that you have that notice of exemption, and that completes your CEQA. In the meantime, in the in-between time, when you don't have that notice of exemption, there's several ways that you could provide the state with evidence that your CEQA compliance is underway. And so it could just be an email communication with your licensing analyst. When they ask you what's the status of CEQA, you can tell them, I've submitted my annual state.
Thank you, Courtney. I want to thank Courtney so much for her expertise and her knowledge of this subject matter. It's very challenging. It's very nuanced. We understand that. And we're going to have more on this subject. Please don't forget to join Jason's Lunch and Learns. It's in the chat. I definitely think that will be helpful. You can ask questions to him. Go on our website and get the time and the date. We really hope you enjoyed watching this webinar.